Welcome back to the Purple Worship Podcast, where we talk about worshiping with your whole life. Once again, I'm joined here by Brandon and CK, and we're continuing our talk about parenting through the corona crisis and fear. And today we're going to be talking a little bit more about what it's like to raise courageous children in a fearful world. So guys, how you doing today?
Doing well.
Great.
All right, well, it's great to have you back. So let's talk a little bit about exactly that. What does it look like to raise courageous children in a fearful world? So just to remind our listeners, if you haven't listened to part one of this, it's very, very foundational. There's a lot of things that we bring up, things like the resurrection is vital. Understanding the resurrection is vital to your fearlessness. And we talked a lot about Psalm 56, when I am afraid, I will trust in you. You have to attack your fear head on. And so we're all fathers here. And, this particular event we talked about last time, it's not really instilling that much fear in our families yet, but definitely people around us are experiencing a lot of fear, and it's not to say that we won't be in that same boat very, very soon. Things might get a lot more serious. We all may be without work for a while. That can be fearful. Any of those things could happen. So what does it look like, when we're talking about raising children in the midst of a very fearful world, particularly now, when everyone it seems like, is fearing something? How do we raise our children to not be that way?
So I'm going to start because I'm going to actually answer a question you didn't ask, which is helpful, isn't it?
Sure.
So I think one thing, especially before we head into storms, is that we want to not teach our children to be reckless. And so, considering I think at least CK and I both still haven't really encountered the coronavirus in any super close way, it can lead to me not teaching my children to be gracious with others. It can lead to them being cavalier, like the temptations there from myself, even unknowingly, to be cavalier about something that other people are very concerned about. And so one thing that I want to be careful to do in this and in general is to teach my children to sympathize with people, and to see where they are, even if we're not there, even if we don't feel what they're feeling. And so that's been a big challenge for me, is I don't want my children to be afraid, but I also don't want my children to be callous or cold to people who are. So that's not really the question you asked, but that's
a good one,
kind of the first thing in my mind as we try to walk through this.
Absolutely.
Because that's what I'm facing.
Yeah, and I mean, you have children that are much older than mine. My oldest is 2.5, and so with him, we definitely deal with the whole, like, he's friends with everybody right now, and he wants to say hi to everybody and tell them about his day and everything. And that includes saying, why are they wearing masks, or why are they doing this, and so
it's pointing and the staring
and so it's one of those where I think everybody appreciates the fact that we're all dealing with this, but when you have someone who literally has no concept, they're empty. Children aren't dumb, they're just empty. And so when you have someone who's empty and they have no knowledge of what is anything, even being sick, apart from the one time he's been sick in his life,
Right.
It's really, really interesting to try and figure out, how do you live in a kind of an above reproach sort of way, and teach your children to do that too. And even for our wives, like, trying to help them instill that sense of innocence, and preserve that within our children, but then also, like you said, to not make them calloused or unaware of the ways that their actions can affect people who could be, we don't know, could be very freaked out, even by my child like running over to them in the park, and that could really freak somebody out. And so I think in that way, a big part of it for me has just been trying to teach our children to, just a good life principle anyway, but just a little, like you said, a little bit of restraint, and try and teach them to approach people in a way that is sort of like the other person would invite them closer. So it's not them rushing up to that person, and just in a general setting that's important, but especially in something like this, for the sake of that other person. Again, just trying to be above reproach and even inconvenience ourselves if necessary
Sure.
to help them feel more at ease with everything.
Definitely. Definitely.
So what if we zoomed out a little bit? What if we zoom out just a bit and ask, what does being courageous, what does being brave look like in a time like this? Because there's a lot of Christians who will just, chant, oh, we're trusting in God and God's in control, which obviously we agree with. But there's a line between wisdom and stupidity, right? And so we have to be wise and trust in God, and at the same time not put people at risk. And we need to love our neighbors, like what you were saying, and even go out of our way, like what Paul would say, I believe, if he was here, because he talked about this for eating meat sacrificed to idols. He would say, if it is something that you can do for somebody else to deprive yourself, then do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's just a minor inconvenience for us at this point, to be kind to somebody, to be loving to somebody. But what does it look like to be brave in a time like this and not be stupid?
I think that I thought you breathed in some, and you were like, "I'm gonna talk," and then you
All those
didn't.
micro
You didn't
cues,
talk.
yeah.
Okay. So it's worse because we can see each other. Maybe, I don't know.
We're
Anyway,
social distancing. We can
right.
observe these things differently. Yeah.
Yes. So, what does it look like to be brave? I think bravery in general. I mean, in general, I want to teach my kids that bravery is not being afraid of the things that God tells you not to be afraid of. Mm-hmm. So. There are plenty of things we should be afraid of. Plenty of things. Fear, like a healthy fear. Like I should have a healthy fear of trucks if I'm standing in the middle of a road, and I should remove myself from the middle of the road. But there are things that I'm not supposed to be afraid of, and I want to teach my children how to handle like wrong fear and right fear. At the same time. And I think bravery is kind of being able to walk that line and recognize what healthy fear is and how healthy fear can actually inform us and help us be careful. But we also, not right now in this time, bravery sometimes is going to look like, putting yourself at risk to help people, so obviously we think of Christians in the medical field, but people in the medical field in general, that's a bravery, that comes at the cost of your potentially your own health for the sake of other people's. And I also think that part of it, and then I will pass the mic, but I think another piece of it that's really important is categorizing things that God says are important. So it's not only not being afraid of things that God tells us not to be afraid of, but it's also being confident to walk in the things that he tells us to do regardless of what happens. So, this isn't, a physical enemy, so to speak, but God tells us a lot about how to deal with enemies. And he tells us a lot about walking forward in the face of persecution or distress, or as we talked about last time in Romans 8, all the things that Paul lists, famine or nakedness or danger or sword. And so part of bravery too is having separate categories for the things that God tells us, being able to prioritize those things.
Yeah, I think a lot about the idea of courageousness, like you said, the people in medical field, or like we have people in our church who are immunocompromised and have even been sick during this time, and they've had family members who have encountered the virus, and then they've had family members who have even died from the virus, and so like you can see the ripple effects very quickly, and the potential is there, since we're not living in fear that we talked about in the the first episode, but being courageous, I think, for me, it always comes back to what you'd said about choosing to put yourself in a position to help people. That doesn't mean putting yourself in the middle of the street and trying to say like
Right.
the trucks aren't a thing, right? Like we need to be
Right.
prudent. But I think we should do everything in our power, one step short of risk or foolishness, to go above and beyond to help people. And so that can mean, I've seen people on our like Nextdoor app and things like that in the neighborhood saying, "Hey, I'm a grad student. I know there are elderly people in this neighborhood. Can I go get you something from the store?" Or
Shopping for them. Yeah.
yeah, like whatever, and those things can be courageous because you're still putting yourself in a position of potentially compromising, but you're doing it in a way that is like immediately applicable and helpful. And I think courageousness can often transition into just a very, very, okay, what can I do next? Like, what's a very pragmatic next step for me? If I have, and even if you don't have eternal security, like some of our children are not saved, and so we can't teach them, or we can't expect them to have that same sense of like that rock to stand on, right? But we can still teach them that as, if you're honoring God in your actions and you're loving your neighbor, then that love for neighbor is a part of that common grace that God applies to all men. And we just need to do good to others. And so even in a situation like this, we can choose to restrain our own fearful reactions to this, and then also then use that as a way to say, some people might not be able to do that. How can I help?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I really like what you said about asking what's next. You think about brave people in movies, and it doesn't matter what's going on around them. It doesn't matter how crazy or terrible things are getting. They just kind of like, this is what I have to do, and then after I do this, this is what I have to do, and after I do this, this is what and I think that's a mark of a brave person, is somebody who just acts like a man and does it. In the case of our, us as fathers, just bucks up and does it.
Yep.
Yeah, and you raised another important point when you talked about people who are stepping up in their communities and helping those who are vulnerable. And I think part of being brave and courageous is leading and stepping up and saying, hey, I'm going to take responsibility for the people around me, even if I haven't been traditionally seen as the leader. Now, obviously, as fathers in our own families, we definitely have that role. So we need to model bravery and courageousness for our children.
Like it or not. That's
right.
We're
have
stuck
to.
there. Yeah.
But,
Right.
but I've been encouraging church members and especially the teens of the church to, hey, look, you have friends who either are churched or maybe they're unchurched, and they are living in fear right now, most likely. And so you be the one to reach out and see if they're doing okay. You be the one to see if they need anything. And, my kids aren't really at an age where they can take that kind of responsibility. So my practical step towards that is just modeling that for them, and as much as I can, involving them in that. But Brandon, I'm kind of curious because you do have kids that are much older and could do some more things, practically speaking. What are some practical ways, whether you're doing them or not, what are some practical ways that dads can get involved in helping their children to take responsibility for their community?
It's an exciting thing once you have, for godly dads, it's a really exciting thing when you have kids who are finally able to kind of come along with you as you do life and ministry and things like that. And I think that's a huge piece of it. It's really just the same thing. It's modeling, it's teaching as we go, and bringing them along with you. But you have the unique option of being able to actually include them in things and give them chances and responsibility, give them ways to serve or help or risk or lead in circumstances in which they wouldn't normally have those opportunities. And so I think that's a big piece of it. It's just, one, we kind of have to be brave to let our children have those opportunities, take those opportunities, and potentially face the consequences or fallout that might come from, well, my middle child is 9. So, and my oldest is 21. And so, but I get to, I mean, with both of them, I get to bring them along in different ways. You know, my 9-year-old, I get to tell him, you know, that when we see people or when we're out, like you were talking about, CK, like I get to tell him how to be loving to people who are fearful or scared by keeping their distance, you know, and not being as friendly as what they normally would be.
Right.
And just being able to watch their wheels turn, that they're considering other people is a huge thing that we get to teach them. And then I get to do that a little bit more with my older kids.
Yeah. I mean, even my 2.5-year-old, there are definitely times where he'll be like, hey, why did they rope off the playground, you know?
Right.
And or he'll say, you know, why can't we go to this person's house, or why don't we have them come over to our house, or things like that. And our response is always some hybrid of, well, do you remember that, you know, right now there's a lot of people who are sick, and or there's people out there who are sick and we don't want to get other people sick. And so we always try and turn it back to how can we teach him, even if he doesn't get it, how can we teach him that mechanic of like, we're doing this because someone else needs something. And so yes, we would, yeah, exactly. Like it's not that we don't want, you know, to have hospitality in our home right now in person. It's because we want to, like you said, Caleb, to kind of be leaders in being part of a peaceful solution to all of this. And so we're going to do whatever we have to do. And if that means we don't play on the playground, you know, we take a walk around instead, then those are little things that we can do, but we help to say, hopefully it's in getting in there somewhere that it's like, this is part of doing our part, you know, and this is something that we can do to kind of help progress this thing.
Well, and it's a huge thing to get your 2-year-old thinking about other people, because 2-year-olds generally don't think about other people.
Don't.
Never, never, ever. My 4-year-old struggles to think about other people ever, even when being told to do so. So that is just a huge thing as dads, I think, with young kids, that we can already get them in the gears of, hey, let's look around and realize we're not the only people here. And even though our family doesn't have a big sickness right now, there are people that do, and there are people who could. And, you know, we can't really explain this to a 2-year-old, but we obviously know that we may not even know it, and we might be carrying it to somebody else. So, you know, the very fact that we're restraining from things that we would normally do as a family, you know, part of our routine is getting to go to Chick-fil-A and play on the playground. We probably do that once a week. Haven't done it in about 3 weeks now. And so it's different, right? And so we can explain to our kids we've changed something, however small it is, because our kids are small, so the changes are small. But however small it is, we've changed something, and the reason we've done it is so that we can be loving our neighbor and thereby glorifying Jesus in the way that we are interacting with our community. And that brings it all the way back to worship. So the worshipful response is inconvenience yourself, right? Do whatever you can to be loving to somebody else. You don't have to. If you don't have to do it, then don't do it, right? And I think that's what our government's been telling us. But as Christians, we should be the ones leading that charge. If you don't have to do it, don't do it. It's not necessary right now. There are things that are necessary, so let's save our fights for the things that are necessary, and not to have to go to the playground and play, right? That's not a necessary thing.
Yeah. I mean, you know, and Peter says in 1 Peter 2, honor all people. And he attaches that with several other things, but he starts with honor all people, you know, and it's, I think the without doing an exegesis of that passage, I think the heart behind that is like, be kind, you know, be kind to people, like do good to people. And I think that's something that takes courage especially in a fearful environment where you choose to add extra to what you would normally do, extra kindness, extra grace, extra patience, you know, whatever it takes, restraint, you know, all of those things can be part of honoring other people. And the more we can sprinkle that in, I feel like the more hopefully whether our kids are 2 or 21 or whatever, like that hopefully that can just be more of a lifestyle, that when we get out of all of this, it's not like we're going to stop doing that. And,
Right.
you know, so in one way, this is just an incubator, like a pressure cooker for that kind of behavior that we can really drill in during this time. And I feel like we need to seize that opportunity while we have it here.
Yeah, you mentioned extra, and I've been encouraging our church family. This is a time when most people are going to be sitting on what they have. But for us, this is a time for us to be radically generous with everything, you know, with your finances, with your resources, with your time, everything, with your thoughts, you know, be radically generous, because that's what's going to set us apart, and that's what's going to draw people to Christ. So as we kind of draw this particular episode to a close, let's bring it back to people who are afraid right now. So what advice would you give to a struggling dad who really wants to lead his children and his families in a Joshua 1:9 kind of faith, a be strong and courageous kind of faith, but yet he's scared to death? And that's reasonable, right? It's a reasonable fear.
Tell your children, you know, like
Absolutely.
just, you know, you said be generous with your thoughts. And I immediately thought, I've never struggled with that. So I'll tell anybody, you know, where I am. But
Oh, how true.
my children, just to live with me is to live with a constant stream of consciousness coming from me about whatever. But you know, being honest with your children,
Yeah.
and as long as, I mean, some parents approach it like, you know, I'm going to protect my kids from
Right.
my fears, my worries, my financial hardships, whatever, and to each their own, I suppose. But I have found it greatly beneficial, and it opens up opportunities for talking. It creates seeds of conversations that happen later. And if I will just share, guys, I'm really struggling with this. I don't know what to think about this. I have no idea. I'm scared, you know, and being able to tell my children that I'm scared, and then that way they get to watch their dad, who is trying, you know, striving, failing, but striving to practice spiritual disciplines, to practice trusting in the promises of God. They get to watch me both, you know, fail and succeed, but they get to see kind of that movement too,
Right.
from fear to faith.
Absolutely. Yeah, we talked about Psalm 56. When I am afraid, I will trust in you. Well, how are your kids going to know that you're trusting in God if you don't let them know that you're afraid?
Right.
Right? How can they know that you're reacting properly if they don't know that you have something to react to? Because otherwise, it's just life as normal. So vulnerability, a really, really big thing. And I 100% agree with that. I think that's awesome.
Yeah, I honestly can't top that. I think it's difficult when, you know, your children are young enough that they might not understand some of those concepts because, you know, like we said, they're empty. They don't know these things, and that's great. You know, I saw a tweet where a lady had her son in a pool outside and said, one of the things I'm most grateful for right now is that my child has no knowledge of this situation, and he's just happy to be in this you know, pool.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a beautiful, wonderful thing. But then the moment that we can start to share that experience and share life with our children in that way, it humanizes us, you know, and it takes courage, I think, for a dad to be human to his children. And I think that's, you know, for me, that's something I really look forward to, is being able to say, like, even, you know, maybe when he turns 3, he'll get it. I don't know. You know, he's 2 going on 20.
Right.
So,
Right.
you know, but I look forward to those times, because I think that really does, like, for me, I remember times when my dad did that and still does that, you know, and he's late 60s. And when he does something like that, I'm like, oh man, you're human, you know?
And I think, and you hit on that. It's a type of bravery, because we want our kids to think that we're Superman. And every time that we admit that we're not, that takes guts to be able to do that, and it brings us down a notch when we do that
5
in
notches.
their eyes. Yeah, even in their eyes. Yeah. But I think, I hope, because it's been my strategy, so I hope it works. I think it's going to pay dividends down the road, because I know that I thought my dad was Superman, but the things that I remember the most are when he was honest and open with me, and even frail at times, because I got to watch his whole process. I didn't just watch him be awesome. I got to watch him work toward that.
Yep.
And so I want to show my kids both. But it does mean that sometimes I don't look as cool as what I wish I did in their eyes.
Right. Well, and that's fantastic advice too, because there is no lasting, meaningful relationship that lasts based on a facade. Nothing. Yeah. You have to be completely transparent in every other relationship, and yet so often with our kids, we try to project an image, and then when it becomes impossible to project that image, usually because something is way over our heads, then all of a sudden their whole house of cards comes crashing down. So
right.
Be open with your kids now. And then I would also add to that, CK, you mentioned having young kids. If they can't quite wrap their heads around those concepts, use this time, especially when you're afraid, to really partner up with your wife, especially if if you're married. My heart goes out to single parents. But if you're married, use this time to bond with your wife and talk through those things. Like, what will we do when we have these opportunities? How do we want to model this before our kids? How can we be intentional about this? And if you are a single parent, find some other trusted advisor in your life that you can talk to and do the same thing.
Definitely.
Don't be afraid alone, right? If you can't be open and honest with your kids about it, and if they're not able to help shoulder some of that load with you, tell somebody. Find a Christian friend, find a pastor, somebody that you can do. Hey, find us. We're available. DM us. We'll be able to help you out, and just pray for you and pray with you and help you plan ahead for the future. So just want to remind you as we wrap up this wonderful podcast. First of all, guys, thanks again for joining me. It's been fantastic talking to you today. And we're reminding all of you out there listening, every minute of every day, we are worshiping something. And so we're encouraging you, worship God. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.